June 11th, 1944, 0412 hours, just outside Gourbesville, Normandy. The air hangs thick with mist, as if the ground itself is holding its breath. A gravel farm road winds between hedgerows just wide enough for a single vehicle. Dew clings to the leaves, and the only sound is the distant growl of an approaching engine. The Germans are on the move. A recon patrol. 4 SDKFZ 222 light armored cars built for speed and observation rolls quietly along the lane. Their mission is simple: chart a path for a larger armored push expected later that day. The lead vehicle moves with confidence. This road has been used before. Then something shifts. A thump. Not loud, more like a tire bumping a pothole. But then a sharp tilt. The front right wheel drops suddenly. The chassis groans. Metal grinds against stone. The vehicle tilts hard. Too hard. 4.5 tons of German engineering lurches sideways. It skids, rolls just enough to topple into a shallow ditch beside the road. One wheel kicks into the air. The car stops moving. The convoy halts. Soldiers dismount, scan the terrain, weapons ready. But there's no gunfire, no mines, no ambush, only silence, and a patch of disturbed earth. A few German troopers investigate. What they find is baffling. The ground looks normal, but just beneath the surface lies a crude construction. 5 rusted shovels, blades wedged into the soil at an angle. Buried fence stakes. A line of sandbags hidden beneath grass, used to tilt the terrain ever so slightly. No explosives, just leverage, just illusion. And it worked. The lead vehicle, now crippled and blocking the road, has created a perfect bottleneck. The second vehicle can't pass. The third is stuck on a slope. Movement halts, radios crackle with confusion. Officers shout for recovery crews. They'll need hours. And they don't have hours. A mile away, hidden behind a hedgerow, Private Frank F. Denius watches through field glasses. He doesn't smile. He speaks into his SCR 610 radio with calm precision, relaying exact coordinates to a nearby artillery unit. 8 minutes later, shells begin to fall. This was no minefield, no ambush in the traditional sense. It was a trap, designed by a radio technician with an eye for mechanics, a head full of battlefield angles, and 5 old shovels no one else thought were worth anything. Yesterday, they laughed at him. Today, smoke rises. For every soldier in 1944, the idea was simple and unbreakable. Armor is stopped by firepower. Everyone believed it. Infantry manuals drilled it in. Training reinforced it. Veterans repeated it to rookies. You want to stop a German armored car? You bring a bazooka team. You plant a mine. You set up a 57mm anti-tank gun. You do not, under any circumstance, bury a handful of rusted shovels under a patch of dirt and expect anything but laughter. That was the doctrine. That was common sense. And that's exactly why Frank F. Denius became a walking contradiction the moment he shared his idea. When Frank first explained his plan, the squad didn't even pretend to hide their amusement. To them, it sounded like something a bored farm boy would dream up, not a battlefield tactic. One soldier told him he'd have better luck throwing the shovels at the Germans. Another suggested painting welcome signs on the dirt patch to complete the comedy. They weren't trying to be cruel. They were simply reacting the way every trained soldier was conditioned to react. You don't stop armored reconnaissance cars with garden tools. You don't outsmart German engineering with ditch angles. You certainly don't replace explosives with fence stakes and wet soil. Frank wasn't just bending the rules. He was smashing them. But Frank saw something they didn't. He wasn't thinking like a rifleman or a bazooka operator. He was thinking like a mechanic. Someone who understood how weight shifts, how wheels bite into terrain, how momentum can betray even the sturdiest machine. He spent days watching German vehicles speed over the same bends, riding over the same patches of gravel, trusting the same slopes. Their confidence was their vulnerability. Frank didn't need to destroy them. He just needed to make them fall down. And once the lead vehicle fell, the entire system behind it would seize up like a jammed gear. In his mind, it wasn't a trap. It was a mechanical failure waiting to happen. The misconception wasn't that shovels were useless. It was that they belonged only to trenches. In reality, they could reshape the battlefield in ways no one expected. Frank understood a brutal truth. A stalled convoy is as good as a dead convoy if artillery has the coordinates. His trap didn't need to kill a single crewman. It just needed to freeze them in place long enough for American shells to finish the job. And when that German SDKFZ-222 flipped on a curve it had driven over a dozen times before, the laughter stopped instantly, because the impossible had just happened. A $1.32 tool had humiliated a machine worth more than most homes back in the States. The myth died right there on that gravel road. Sometimes the smallest tool becomes the sharpest weapon, if the mind using it sees what everyone else overlooks. Franklin F. Denius wasn't born into the battlefield. He was dropped into it, like so many young American men pulled from civilian life into the chaos of war. In 1943, he was a student at the University of Texas, more interested in engineering diagrams and electrical systems than in rifles or formations. But when he was drafted, he adapted quickly. The Army labeled him a communications technician, assigned him to the 90th Infantry Division, and handed him a radio pack, a wrench, and a rifle. What they didn't realize was that they'd just put a battlefield tactician in the making into one of the most dynamic theaters of the war. Frank wasn't flashy. He didn't shout, didn't brag, didn't seek attention. What he did was watch. When other men counted bullets, he counted terrain features. When they memorized field codes, he studied angles of descent, friction drag on tires, and the stress points of light armored vehicles. When most saw a muddy slope, he saw a lever. The war was a machine to him, brutal, clunky, and predictable if you paid close enough attention. His position in the division gave him a strange advantage. As a radio technician, he moved with forward observers, engineers, and command units. He saw how convoys formed. He saw how they broke. He saw where German vehicles accelerated, where they hesitated, and how they handled wet ground. And slowly, quietly, he started to see an opportunity, not to destroy the enemy in a blaze of fire, but to unbalance them, to jam the gears of their machine until it collapsed under its own weight. It started with sketches. Frank kept a notebook filled with strange diagrams, wheelbase measurements, axle tilt thresholds, center of mass markers for different vehicle classes. He wasn't guessing. He was engineering. A SDKFZ-222, he calculated, had a dangerous tendency to tilt when the front wheel dropped more than 8 inches on one side. Combine that with a 20-degree slope and soft ground, that was a flip waiting to happen. But raw numbers don't matter if you can't act. That's where Frank's initiative came through. He didn't ask for permission. He gathered unused shovels from a depot, salvaged fence stakes from a destroyed barn, and borrowed 2 men from his squad for terrain prep. They thought he was wasting time. He thought he was laying a trigger. Frank didn't look like a threat. He looked like a kid fixing a fence. But behind his calm demeanor was the understanding that you don't have to shoot a tank to beat it. You just have to make it fall over. The U.S. Army didn't plan for this kind of weapon, but it created the environment for it. Flexible command, material surplus, and the freedom for soldiers to think. And Frank thought differently. In war, emotion and heroism may fill the stories, but numbers write the ending. In 1944, the U.S. Army issued approximately 240,000 M1910 entrenching shovels to infantry units across Europe. That's one for nearly every frontline rifleman, more than 4 times the number of bazookas in service. Each shovel cost just $1.32 to manufacture, could be mass-produced in under 15 minutes, and was made of high-carbon steel designed to resist bending even under extreme stress. Originally intended for trench digging and latrine work, it was never meant to be a weapon. But the battlefield doesn't care what tools were designed for. Compare that with the German DKFZ 222, a light armored car weighing 4.5 tons, equipped with a 20mm cannon and machine gun. It was fast, agile, and lightly armored, perfect for reconnaissance. But it had an Achilles heel, a narrow wheelbase, and high center of gravity. Field manuals from both German and Allied intelligence estimated that a lateral axle tilt beyond 30 to 35 degrees could cause the vehicle to tip under its own momentum. That's all it took. One wheel slipping too far, one dip hidden in the dirt, and the armored car became a coffin on wheels. That's where Frank Denius's thinking cut through the myth. He understood that terrain, properly manipulated, could be more lethal than any explosive. A shallow trench, dug at just the right angle on the inside edge of a curve, could mimic natural erosion. Add some camouflage, a light sprinkling of gravel, a few loose tufts of grass, and it vanished to the naked eye. Place 5 shovels angled beneath the top layer of soil to control collapse timing, and you had a vehicle-sized snare. No detonation, no trigger, no sound. But the result was physics, and physics doesn't miss. One vehicle stalls, the next can't pass. The third can't reverse without exposing itself to open terrain. Radios jam as officers argue, and the entire column becomes an artillery bullseye. U.S. forward observers, aided by line of sight and superior FM radio sets, could call in coordinates within 5 minutes. Once the lead vehicle was stuck, its fate, and the fate of those behind it, was sealed. This wasn't improvisation. This was asymmetrical warfare by spreadsheet. A $1.32 investment could neutralize a $100,000 military machine, not by force, by interruption, by collapse. The math didn't lie. And once commanders saw the reports, convoys halted by unidentified road hazards, light armor flipped without explosives, columns wiped out after sudden delays, they stopped laughing at the shovel. Because in the end, numbers always win. June 10th, 1944. Dusk falls over the outskirts of Gourbesville, a quiet village tucked between hedgerows and farmland in Normandy. Rain has made the soil soft, and the air carries a quiet, expectant pressure. Frank Denius crouches beside a sloping gravel road, a curve he's watched German patrols use for 3 nights in a row. With him are 2 other GIs from his communications team, unaware that they're helping build one of the most unconventional weapons of the campaign. Frank's plan is already in motion. He's selected a gentle turn where the outer edge drops into a shallow ditch. Not deep enough to be suspicious, but just enough to unbalance a vehicle if the support gives out. They start digging. 5 shovels are arranged diagonally beneath the topsoil, their steel blades forming a subtle slope shift. A few rotted fence posts are wedged deeper to create hidden instability. Sandbags, slit and flattened, provide disguised leverage against the outer edge. On the surface, it looks like uneven terrain, the kind that's everywhere in Normandy. Frank takes one last look, wipes his hands, and mutters, "We'll know if it works before breakfast." It doesn't take that long. June 11th, 0412. Fog blankets the road. A German SDKFZ 222 armored car leads a recon column of 4 vehicles. It hits the turn fast, too fast for the road's current condition. The right front wheel dips, the frame groans. Then, with a grinding moan, the vehicle tips hard to the side. One axle catches. The car slams into the ditch at a crooked angle, half on its side, half still spinning. The crew stumbles out, stunned but alive. The second car brakes, swerves slightly, and stalls to avoid hitting the first. The third halts entirely, boxed in. The road, 1 lane and bracketed by hedgerows, has become a bottleneck. Engines idle, radios crackle. But the damage is already done. A mile away, lying prone in wet grass, Frank Denius observes through binoculars. He raises his SCR 610 field radio and transmits. His voice is low, steady, emotionless. Coordinates, wind direction, vehicle count. 8 minutes later, the first shells arrive. The second armored car explodes in a flash of flame and metal. The third takes shrapnel through its exposed side. The fourth reverses, right into the fire zone. Chaos erupts. There's no cover, no room to maneuver. In under 15 minutes, the entire recon element is either destroyed or retreating, leaving behind twisted steel and burning oil. The only trigger was a patch of soft dirt. After the artillery silence returns, a U.S. patrol approaches the site. They find what's left of Frank's trap: splintered stakes, dented shovel blades, scattered gravel. One soldier stares at the wreckage and mutters, "They really flipped from that?" Yes, they did. That morning, Frank didn't fire a shot, but his trap flipped the battlefield. The real impact of Frank Denius's shovel trap wasn't felt just on that lonely road outside Gourbesville. It echoed through the entire sector like a silent alarm. Within 24 hours, German recon teams reported the route as compromised. What should have been a reliable path for light armor and supply trucks was now considered potentially mined. They didn't know it wasn't explosives. They just knew something flipped their vehicle, and they weren't about to test it again. That one event, a single flipped SDKFZ 222, triggered a cascade of caution. German officers rerouted their columns through less familiar ground. Alternate roads were longer, slower, and far more exposed to aerial reconnaissance. The tactical picture shifted. Every minute spent maneuvering through safer terrain was another minute for the Americans to reposition, reinforce, or call in air support. Frank hadn't just delayed a patrol. He'd bent the rhythm of the enemy's movement. More importantly, word spread within American units. Infantrymen talk. Radio chatter moved faster than official reports. Other squads in the 90th Infantry Division began copying Frank's method. At first, it was crude, shallow ditches, poorly disguised soil traps. But once they saw the effect, things escalated. Engineers got involved. Platoon sergeants gave the nod. Suddenly, every patrol route and every narrow road between hedgerows was a potential weapon in disguise. By the end of June 1944, at least 17 documented cases of terrain-based mechanical disruption were logged by the U.S. First Army in western Normandy. Most never made it into the headlines. There were no dramatic shootouts, no captured vehicles paraded through Paris, just vehicles stalled, supply lines rerouted, and hours, sometimes days, stolen from the German timetable. And that was the real damage. Because in war, delay equals decay. Every postponed attack weakens momentum. Every detour gives defenders time to dig in, and every stalled engine means one less hammer blow from the enemy machine. German command grew increasingly paranoid. Memo traffic began including orders to verify terrain integrity before movement. Recon crews dismounted more often. Movement slowed. Confidence cracked. One officer wrote in his field diary, "Even the roads betray us now. It's like the ground favors the Americans." Frank Denius didn't intend to start a movement. He just wanted to stop a convoy. But when one cheap trap changed a battlefield's tempo, it proved something devastating. You don't need to destroy the enemy. You just have to delay them long enough for the rest of the machine to do its work. To understand how deeply Frank Denius's crude little trap cut into the German war effort, you have to see it from their side of the wire, through the eyes of the crews who rolled into it without a clue. The Wehrmacht had built its image on speed, precision, and coordination. Their light armored recon units, like the SDKFZ 222s and 250s, weren't designed for brute force, but for swift movement and information gathering. In Blitzkrieg, they were the eyes and ears. Their confidence came from habit, tight formations, trusted roads, rehearsed maneuvers. Normandy challenged all of that. But nothing rattled them like the sudden feeling that even the road beneath their tires might be lying. A translated field report from a recon unit dated June 12, 1944, described an incident eerily similar to Frank's trap. A vehicle overturned on suspected soft terrain, without encountering any visible explosive or obstacle. The commander's comment: this was not sabotage in the traditional sense. This was calculated terrain treachery. In the days following the Gourbesville incident, intercepted radio chatter revealed a growing anxiety. Phrases like "road integrity unknown" and "halt movement until terrain inspected" began appearing frequently in encrypted messages. German engineers were now being sent ahead of recon columns, not to clear mines, but to walk the road with poles prodding dirt and gravel like it might explode. It wasn't just about being delayed. It was about being undermined, literally and psychologically. Captured prisoners from recon units later gave even clearer pictures. One corporal said, "It was like the Americans had made the roads themselves dangerous. Even when we saw nothing, we hesitated." It was the not knowing that froze us. Another German driver told interrogators that he refused to lead convoys through certain roads unless he saw them walked by others first. His voice shook when describing the moment his comrade's vehicle just fell sideways like it had been pushed by a ghost. Perhaps the most telling account came from a lieutenant who wrote in his field diary, recovered after a retreat from the Sainte-Mère-Église area. He described the cumulative fear setting in. "Our armor cannot breathe. The earth itself opens under us." These weren't the words of men facing overwhelming firepower. These were the words of soldiers rattled by silence, betrayed by terrain, and caught off guard by what they couldn't see. That's what made Frank's trap so lethal. Not the steel it wrecked, but the trust it shattered. Because when you lose faith in the ground beneath your feet, you've already lost more than time. You've lost initiative. June 14th, 1944. 2 days after the Gourbesville trap had flipped a German convoy into chaos, a similar scene played out just 6 kilometers east, near the outskirts of Sainte-Mère-Église. This time, it wasn't Frank Denius behind the trap. It was another unit, the 2nd Battalion, 357th Infantry Regiment, who had heard what Frank did and decided to try it for themselves. They had no engineers, no explosives, and very little time. But what they did have was terrain, shovels, and word-of-mouth proof that it worked. They chose a narrow dirt road just off a small ridge, bordered by steep hedgerows, and often used by German light convoys. There were no mines, no tripwires, just 3 shallow trenches, dug off to the side of a bend where vehicles might swerve wide in the dark. The goal wasn't to kill, it was to catch, and it worked almost identically. At approximately 0330 hours, a column of German light armored vehicles, including a SDKFZ 250 and 2 trucks filled with ammunition and supplies, approached the bend. The lead vehicle, traveling faster than intended, hit the disguised trench at just the wrong angle. The right track slipped. The ground, softened by overnight rain and pre-loosened by the Americans, gave way slightly. Not a collapse, just a subtle shift, enough to tip the balance. The half-track rolled into the ditch sideways. The second vehicle braked, skidded, and collided with the back of the first. The third froze in place. Within 20 seconds, the entire convoy had jammed into a steel knot, boxed in with no room to maneuver or retreat. That's when the mortars began to fall. U.S. forward observers on the ridge had been watching the whole approach. With the convoy trapped, the call went out. And within minutes, 60mm mortar shells blanketed the stalled column. No firefight, no warning, just precision and timing. When the dust settled, 2 vehicles were burning, 1 was flipped, and at least 14 German soldiers were dead or wounded. American casualties, 0. The incident was logged as routine, another disruption engagement. But for those who planned it, the lesson was crystal clear. This wasn't a one-time fluke. This was a formula: trap, stall, strike. The pattern repeated itself again days later in nearby Carentan, and then west of La Cambe. Always the same mechanics, always the same results. And always built on something no one had taken seriously: the humble shovel. In each of these case studies, the effectiveness wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. Germans began refusing to take roads that looked too clean. Entire columns were delayed while engineers checked for fake depressions. Some officers even ordered movement only during daylight to reduce the risk of falling into unseen traps. The battlefield had become unpredictable, and all because of a few inches of dirt. By mid-July 1944, one quiet truth had settled into the minds of both American GIs and German officers alike. The battlefield was no longer defined solely by bullets, bombs, or steel. Terrain itself had become a weapon, and the man who first proved it didn't carry a rifle. He carried a radio and a toolbox. Frank Denius hadn't set out to change the rules. He simply noticed a crack in the system, a flaw in how war machines interacted with the world beneath them. And he acted. He didn't challenge tanks with firepower. He challenged them with gravity, slope, soil, and timing. His victory wasn't measured in enemy kills, but in minutes stolen from the enemy's advance. His trap outside Gourbesville didn't just flip one vehicle. It flipped the tempo of the entire operation in that sector. One stall led to one delay. That delay created vulnerability. Vulnerability became opportunity. And when American artillery filled the gap, the result was total devastation. All because someone thought to angle a shovel beneath the dirt. This wasn't luck. It wasn't improvisation. It was logic, execution, and the kind of low-cost, high-impact thinking that defined the American way of war in Europe. Adaptive, decentralized, and ruthless when it counted. The Germans never quite figured out how to counter it. They couldn't retrain their doctrine in time. Their reliance on speed and known routes became a liability. And while they feared Allied firepower, it was the ground beneath their tires that began to haunt them. Frank's weapon had no serial number. It didn't make noise, it didn't shine. But it broke steel. It shattered confidence. It made officers question the land itself. That's not just tactical disruption, that's psychological warfare. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson buried in the mud of Normandy. Victory doesn't always come from overwhelming force. Sometimes it comes from a forgotten tool, a quiet idea, and a battlefield that finally learned to fight back. Not with a bang, not with a blast, but with a lean, a slip, and a crash. And when the smoke clears, no one asks what gun fired first. They ask, how the hell did we get flipped by a shovel? In war, it's easy to remember the thunder, the artillery barrages, the tank duels, the screaming dive of a Stuka, or the roar of P-47 engines overhead. But sometimes the quietest victories speak the loudest. What Frank Denius proved on a foggy road in Normandy wasn't just that a simple trap could stop a German convoy. He proved that ideas, not just weapons, win wars. That initiative on the ground, from a low-ranking soldier with a wrench and a radio, could ripple upward and outward, changing how a battlefield breathes. The shovel in his hands became more than a tool. It became a message. Nothing on this battlefield is neutral. Not the roads, not the grass, not the soil beneath your boots. Anything can be used. Everything can be turned. And once your enemy starts fearing the ground itself, you've already won more than terrain. You've taken their confidence. You've taken their time. You've taken control.